Did you learn in school about Alaska being part of Russia? Like, were you all taught about that?
Yeah, of course. But the major feeling in Russia that it was unfairly taken away from Russian heads, that it wasn't a fair deal, that it was always a feeling of proudness. Alaska should have been Russian, but the Russian Tsar made a stupid mistake and sold it for nothing.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Pope Francis described this past Sunday as an Easter of war. He was, of course, referring to the Russian conflict with Ukraine that started 2 months ago and shows no signs of abating. For people living in countries along the western border of Russia, like Finland and Estonia, the threat of that war spilling into their territory is real. Today we speak with two of my friends there, Eva Finch, an Estonian living in Finland, and Valeri Zahharov, who moved to Estonia from Russia as a teenager, but strongly identifies as an Estonian. I spoke with them both via Zoom a few days ago. Welcome, Eva Finch, to the podcast.
Hello, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. So I will just tell our listeners that you and I met in 2001, over 20 years ago, which is unbelievable. But
It is. Oh, really? Yeah. You had to tell me that because I wasn't sure actually what year it was. But yeah, it must have been 2001. Yeah.
You grew up in Estonia as a native Estonian speaker during Soviet times.
Yeah.
Your particular lifespan is interesting because you had sort of your childhood and then you lived in Estonia through the transition.
That's not the secret. I was born in 1967 and spent my whole childhood, yes, in Soviet Estonia. But I have to say that, well, of course, it was then Soviet, part of the Soviet Union, but I've always thought of it as Estonia. I've even heard slightly sort of surprising remarks that you must have suffered or stuff like this, which I didn't do. Yeah, I was a child and I had an ordinary childhood. I had a home and family and grandparents and toys and television and books and school and all those things. So in that sense, I wasn't really experiencing any totalitarianism.
There were some things present then that are not present now, like mandatory. You had to study Russian in school.
Yeah, I'm very glad that I did. Yeah,
because and that's no longer mandatory. Students don't have to study Russian.
It is true, although many schools still teach it, and I think it's a good thing to do. If you have such a big neighbor, it's always better to understand them than not.
When I asked about interviewing for the podcast, I said that I wanted to get an Estonian perspective on what is happening in Ukraine. And you texted that you weren't sure that you had that much to say. And I think I'm just going to kind of put words in your mouth and then you can correct me. So in America, there was a lot of Ukrainian coverage early on in the conflict. Mm-hmm. I think the average Alaskan, at least, has gotten a little bit weary of the constant coverage. And so I think although you could continue to follow the conflict in Ukraine every day, I think many people are kind of getting back to their everyday lives, and it's very much in the background. Is the conflict in Ukraine front and center in your...
Oh, very much. Very much. Mm-hmm. And we just can't stop reading news. I really have to make a conscious effort to stop reading the news in Finnish, in Estonian, in English, sometimes even in Russian. And Finland has 1,300 kilometer long border with Russia. And Finland is not a NATO country. So That's something that must make us all think very hard how to be prepared. And here in Finland, people really have been advised to make sure that we've got enough food, water, batteries, battery-powered radio, all these things, because we just have to be really as well prepared as we can. We've been advised what to take to the bomb shelter, make sure where our nearest shelter is.
Do you think that Finland not being a part of NATO makes Finland a more easy target than Estonia, which is part of NATO?
Finland is not an easy target. Finland is very militarily very strong for a country that is relatively small, 5.5 million. But I think Finland has something like 800,000 reserve troops and very good air defense and other weaponry, which I'm not at all an expert of. But Finland is well prepared. There's also lots of discussion of applying for NATO membership, which Finland is probably going to do now, either at the end of April or sometime in May, basically soon.
Your mother's still in Estonia, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so you still have family in Estonia. You are Estonian.
Yeah, my daughter, my grandchildren, yeah.
Okay. So I guess for our listeners, you have 2 older daughters who have their own children, and then you have 2 younger daughters in high school, basically, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Estonia and Finland are very different. I mean, they were, or what I would say is they were very different 20 years ago. I feel that there has been a condescension from Finland to Estonia. At least that was my experience 20 years ago. I heard Finnish people say that Estonians spoke like a children's language. I've heard Finnish people who basically looked down on Estonia because of lack of infrastructure and modernization that was a result of having been part of the Soviet Union. And, it was really a lucky break that Finland was not part of the Soviet Union, and 10,000 Estonians fought to protect Finland from Russia in World War II. I just think...
Maybe not 10,000. I think the number was something like 3,500. But Estonia is a small country.
Thank you for the correction.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just giving a little bit of background that, the 2 countries share the same tune for their national anthem. I'm going to totally mess this up, Eva, so you'll have to correct me. But 1917, when they both became independent countries.
Right. Yeah, Finland became independent country in 1917, and Estonia 2 months later, early 1918. Part of the 20th century went not that differently. But then from the Second World War onwards, Estonia was annexed. Estonia was actually occupied by the Soviet Union and forcefully made a part of it.
Right.
Which many countries didn't even recognize. But Finland, of course, did, because Finland was in turn forced to become kind of not exactly a satellite country, but sort of friendly country of the Soviet Union. They had to be kind of careful and find the right way of interacting. Yeah, it's very easy to judge them for that, but what options did they have, really? And now that's also the reason why Finland is not a NATO member still, because it would have angered Russia, basically. But now they feel that that's enough is enough, and now it's the time. As for this condescending, you're right that there has been some of that, but not at all every Finn is looked down on Estonians, quite vice versa. And I must say that in recent weeks, there have been increasingly sort of approving, or it has been said that Estonia was right. Estonians were right. We should have listened to them more, because Estonians have been banging on about the threat from Russia ever since, the early 2000s, especially after the 2007 cyber attacks to Estonia, 2008 attack of Georgia, 2000 and let alone total genocide in Chechnya, plus taking the Crimea in 2014 by Russia, which we were all but like largely overlooked by the West, plus what Russia has done in Syria. So in that sense, I don't think that the Estonians, big as the shock about the war, I don't think that the thinking changed much or the fears have risen much, because we've always known that that's what Russia is like.
How safe do you feel right now in Turku?
I feel quite safe, actually. One thing is that Turku is like more than 300 kilometers away from Russian border.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that they will very easily get here, even if they want to attack Finland. I find it very unlikely that they will attack Finland with any actual warfare. I find it more likely that they could do something like hacking, cyber attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite likely.
Do you feel that Finland is less at risk than the Baltic states?
No, I feel Finland is more at risk.
Although we are not nearly in the crosshairs the way Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are, I think that there are many Alaskans who in the back of their mind think, well, if Putin were absolutely insane, there is access to the United States through this far northern border. So we do share a little bit of the anxiety, for sure.
Mm-hmm. I guess we all do, actually. If you live in a world like this, in a big country who has nuclear weapons, then you can't, feel entirely safe. What can you do? But we just have to live with it. I guess that, and hope for the best. And we somehow have to hope that the economic sanctions that most of the world is now putting on Russia will have their effect.
Do you think it's having an effect?
Well, not fast enough. And at the moment, they're not in place because Europe keeps buying fuels, gas and fuel from Russia for much, much bigger sums of money than they are giving to Ukraine. How
are you personally coping with the threat of kind of hanging over your head for more than a few weeks? Like it's probably going to go on.
I just know that there is no way Russia can win this war. They're not. It's just I would say the beginning of their end, or at least this Putin's government's, but something more. There might be really hard times ahead, but I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I do get some new kind of hope from all this horror, that at least it clears the air and some truth has been, seen.
Eva Finch, I want to thank you so much. I know that with the time zone, it is past your bedtime in Turku, Finland. It's still in the morning here in Anchorage, Alaska. But I'm so grateful to you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad if I could be of any assistance. Yeah. And allow me to say at the end, for the end of the interview, Slava Ukraini.
Hello, it's me, Corey Coolidge, and I hope you've been enjoying this interview from Eva Finch. I gotta say, if you're like me, you have a lot of friends who love to talk about politics. And I tell them all the same thing. Quiet down and listen to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. It's where you can find the best voices in Anchorage politics. They'll thank you for the recommendation, and we'll thank you for spreading the word. We have another great interview coming right up, Valeri Zahharov.
Valeri Zahharov, welcome to the podcast.
Hello there. Good morning, Estonia, and probably good evening in Alaska.
Yes, it's nighttime here. But luckily, it's spring. It's still light outside, so that's good. Valeri, you and I have known each other for over 20 years. I met you when I was living in Tallinn, Estonia. What I wanted to do is talk a little bit about where you grew up. We'll start there. Where did you grow up?
Right. Yeah. Well, I was born in Russia, actually, in the middle part of European part of Russia, the city called Samara. I was living there with my family until I was 16. And then my family moved to Estonia, where I'm still living now.
And why did your family move to Estonia?
That was my father or my parents' decision, actually. And I guess, back then it was like mid-90s. The life in Russia was quite difficult economically. But also, my father was always like very liberal, hating Soviet Union and say power like that. And I guess even back then in the mid 90s, he had a feeling that the things in Russia are not going in a good direction, and he wanted to move somewhere where his family would be more secure. And
right.
He decided
so
for Estonia. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. And I think for our listeners who may not be super informed about what it was like to live in Russia right after the Soviet Union fell, I think that a stereotype that listeners might have is that life got suddenly much better as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed. It didn't. Can you talk a little bit about, because you were a child in the Soviet Union and then you were like a teenager when it became free. What did you notice?
For me, what's going on now in Russia and the whole invasion of Ukraine is very much connected with what happened in Russia or in the beginning of 90s, because all of a sudden, many people, or majority of people, got really, really poor. They didn't have money to buy food or clothes or anything. And they didn't have like a very luxury life in the Soviet times either, but at least they felt it was secure. You were guaranteed to get cheap bread and cheap sausage. That's what the Communist Party gave you, but not more than that. And all of a sudden it was gone, and you were left at your own to provide for the family. And people then didn't have jobs, and it was kind of a mess. Yes, people got freedom of speech, and beginning of democracy, but at the same time, economically they were very poor, and plus they felt that the big country that they were living all their life all suddenly disappeared. The empire was gone, which they felt that, especially I think people in Russia felt it was unfair that they kind of lost the Cold War, and now they're being punished, mistreated for that. Right.
Mm-hmm. You moved to Estonia in the mid 90s. Estonia was only recently free. Did you notice right away that Estonia was doing better than Samara? Or you moved to Tallinn, so was Tallinn better than Samara? Did you immediately feel a difference?
Yes, and it wasn't so much about that the people had more money. The people were still quite poor in Estonia, but it was more the life was well organized. There were not crime. I could, my people could let me walk outside and go anywhere at nighttime without worried about me, because in Russia at that time, because the state was collapsed, the mafia guys took over, but it wasn't the case in Estonia. And plus, there was a kind of a hope, because Estonia got independent for the second time in their history, and the people have very, very high hopes. Now, yes, we have a very long way to go, but we're going somewhere good place, and we know what to do to get there. But in Russia, people were still confused, and probably still are, at what's going to happen to them. And so that was the bigger difference for me.
I do want to teach my listeners a little bit about you and compare and contrast you with other Russians who moved to Estonia, because you speak Estonian completely fluently, and you've been able to speak Estonian completely fluently for 20 years. But you moved to Estonia when you were 16. So, for some people, it would be very difficult to learn Estonian as a teenager the way you have. And in my experience living in Estonia 20 years ago, there was certainly parts of the Russian community that existed in Russian language. Like they really didn't learn Estonian. They had their own shops. They had their own culture within Estonia,
Right.
where it was
Yeah.
possible to live and not understand Estonian. I don't know if that's changed in the last 20 years or not, but can you talk about your decision to really fully integrate into Estonia?
Actually, part of the reason why my family moved to Estonia, because my parents thought it would be like easier because there is, as you mentioned, a big Russian speaking community. And therefore, because we didn't speak much English either, it would be like easier to organize our everyday life. But for me, I felt that it's a new country, it's a new language, and I was excited to learn that. But compared to the local Russians, who even the same guys of my age, teenagers, if they were born in the Soviet Union times, and they didn't have to learn Estonian, and all of a sudden Estonia is the major language, and they even had a kind of protest against it. Why all of a sudden? If you like live in Alaska, and all of a sudden they decide, oh, now we have to all speak French for whatever reason.
Right.
Why should we do it? But for me, it was like natural moving to a new country, a new culture, a new language. And I was excited about that. But I remember that I always, in the beginning, like let's say first 6 months when I didn't speak much of Estonian, I felt embarrassed going to hospital, for instance, and not able to communicate in Estonian. I had to apologize for that and show them that it's not because I ignore you. I just came here, so that's why I speak Russian to you. And I got a very positive response to that when I started speaking Estonian, even a few words.
Does that tight-knit Russian language community still exist in Estonia? I mean, are there still...
Yes, it's still there, but it's a little bit, the edges are smoother in a way because the older generation is still there, but the younger guys are speaking Estonian and Russian, and they're learning it at school. So it's a very slow process, but it's less as severe as it was 20 years ago.
Right. And do you feel? I mean, for our listeners, I mean, you live your life in Estonian. You live in Estonia, and you speak Estonian, and your spouse is Estonian, and you speak Estonian with your spouse, and you have a child, and you speak Estonian. Or are you trying to teach your child Russian? I don't know.
I try to teach her some Russian, but without much success because it's my own laziness in a way. It's much easier to speak one language in the family. Yeah. So she's mostly Estonian. Yeah.
Right. So I would say, for all intents and purposes, you identify as an Estonian, correct?
It's interesting because in the beginning, I would identify myself as a Russian living in Estonia, then Russian Estonian. But recently, I identify myself as Estonian. I don't have much connection with Russia, but that I was born there. A little bit, in English language, you have only one word. It's a big actually problem for me for Russia as well, because all over media it's Russia. Mm-hmm. But in Russian language, they have two words. One is meaning Russia as a country, and another is Russians as ethnically Russian. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and whenever I heard Russia, for me it's including myself, and I don't want to be. I'm not part of that anymore. So that's why I cannot identify as Russian anymore in English language, at least. Mm-hmm. So I would call myself Estonian. Yes.
Right. And one thing I just want to say for our listeners, when a Russian person moves to Estonia, I mean, there is absolutely nothing in common between the Russian language and the Estonian language. For people who don't know, Estonian is a Finno-Ugric language. It's related much, much closer to Finnish than it is to Russian. In fact, I mean, to most people listening, they would think Russian is the most foreign language possible, but actually Russian is less foreign to English than Estonian is.
Right. It's the same difference between English and Chinese.
Exactly. I talked to our mutual friend Eva, who's living in Finland. She talked about how Ukraine dominates the news there, that there's really no escaping from, if you, unlike in America, where if we choose not to engage with the news about Ukraine, it's possible. Do you feel that it's dominating the news in Estonia as well?
Absolutely, yeah. And because we live in such a news bubble, it's all Ukraine. I'm shocked by what you're saying now, that it's possible not to look into things in Ukraine if you live in the US.
I noticed right away that the Estonian parliament issued a unanimous resolution the day after Russia invaded Ukraine, requesting that the EU grant emergency European Union status to Ukraine.
I know what I'm talking about, but it wasn't as black and white, I think. It wasn't unanimous. There are still people in the parliament who are against it. And like the Estonian Nationalist Party, which is, many people say, is sponsored by Putin, was against that. And but there was a big support for Ukraine and for them to join the European Union as well. That's correct, yes.
How big is the Estonian Nationalist Party?
They, I guess in the last elections, they got like roughly 20% of votes. They're like mostly Estonians. And in the past, they were like very anti-Russians as well. But at the same time, it's very interesting that they're very much anti-Russians until the last elections, when they basically changed their speech and became not so much pro-Russians, but they tried to find the same things that the conservative Russians like for instance, anti-gay movement unites them, which again is kind of the Kremlin talking point. So if they have to choose who they hate more, do they hate like LGBT community more or Russians? They say, oh, the Russians also hate LGBT people. Let's unite on that basis, although we can hate them later. So this is kind of that kind of approach.
Well, 20% is not a very large percentage, but I'm also curious, are they sort of anti-intervention? Like, let's worry about Estonia. We don't need to worry about Ukraine. Let's focus on what we need to focus on here. Is that kind of their mentality?
Yes. So they say, yes, we have to be independent and we don't want Russia to be here, but let's, exactly as you say, let's worry about Estonia. Let's not provoke Russia to attack us. Why should we give our weapon? Estonia gave more weapon than any other country, like pro capita. Then why should we do that? Let's keep all the weapons ourselves. So if Russia invades us, then it's our problem. But if we give too much to Ukraine, we'll make Russians attack us instead.
Right.
So this kind of approach.
So that's interesting. So Estonia is part of NATO. Do you feel that being part of NATO is providing you with some peace of mind that Russia won't invade you?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's without that, I guess many people would be, already so worried, and it would be like a real problem for us. But we, hope that NATO will protect us. And but at the same time, I understand that it's not the major NATO country, and it will probably come to many surprise that for citizens of US that all of a sudden they have to protect Estonia. Even last night, actually, all of a sudden, my spouse Eero mentioned, he was looking at the NATO map and said, I didn't know that North Macedonia was part of NATO. And I told him, so you didn't realize you'll have to protect it if anything happens? And it was like, it was some small country we didn't know about it, that it's part of NATO. So that's a little bit of that worry in Estonians as well, that we are so small that if we're attacked, and although we're in NATO, that maybe, for major powers, that will not be a good reason enough to start the real war with Russia.
Well, as I said, I spoke with Eva yesterday. She's in Finland. She feels very strongly that because Finland is not in NATO, that Finland is at higher risk for invasion than Estonia, although she also said that Finland is militarily prepared, probably better than some of the other countries along the border with Russia. And what was interesting in the news today, Finland and Sweden want NATO membership, and they want it by June 21st. But Russia has said that there will be enormous consequences. They're very upset that Finland and Sweden are considering joining NATO.
To be honest, I disagree with Eva. I don't think that Finland is in more danger than Estonia because they're outside of NATO at the moment. And it's not about how well they're prepared for the war, how much military they have. I feel that the only, for Russia to attack any country, they should feel that they're entitled to. And they felt so about Georgia, they felt so about Ukraine, and they might feel so about Estonia because it was part of the Soviet Union, and there are many Russian speakers here, and it gives Putin, authority to speak and to say, "Oh, we're going to protect them," and he's supported by the majority of population in Russia based on that. Finland, historically was part of Russian Empire, but it hasn't been so for over a century. So they don't have any reason to attack them unless Finland, attacks them as well. So that's why I think it's very different. So they might punish them economically or close the border or whatever, but military, they cannot do anything. They will not because.
Do you have any family still in Russia?
Yes, I do. Not immediate family, but some aunts and cousins. I do.
Do you talk to them?
I do, but mostly my mom does, and I'm in shock because I have only one aunt who says it's a horrible war, but the majority of our relatives are either neutral, saying it's a big politics, we don't want to interfere, or even support it, saying yes, it was about time that the Ukrainians should be punished.
The ones who are neutral or sort of in favor, do you think it's because of the news that they're getting?
Absolutely, it's the news, and I don't think they have felt yet what it means to be in a war. They haven't seen, their relatives dying yet. They haven't seen any, even economically. They're starting to feel that, but not quite. And majority of the people, for some reason, I think it should be over in a couple of weeks, and then things should be like back to normal, right? And they were quite like one of my mom's best friends was very annoyed because she couldn't go to her vacation in Sochi, just like next to Ukrainian border, saying why should we stop? It's all Ukraine's fault and
right.
Things like that, which shocked me, right? Not realizing people are dying at the same time, and she's complaining not having vacation.
So I guess to explain that, how do they think it's Ukraine's fault? Explain what that means. Like, why does a Russian think that it's Ukraine's fault that Russia had to go to war with Ukraine?
Because majority of the people feel that Ukrainians are second-class people, and they should be always supporting Russia and give them all the respect they deserve. And Ukrainians' desire to join European Union and go to Europe is like a betrayal. And all of a sudden, you're like a second class, and all of a sudden you don't want to, take my orders. It's you should be punished for them. And plus the whole propaganda saying that the power in Ukraine belongs to Nazis, as they call them, new Nazis, and the many people buy this argument, saying yes, the Nazis are in power. There are probably regular Ukrainians are good people, but they're in control of these Nazis. Let's liberate them. That's an argument which is surprisingly very convincing for the Russians.
Now, we hear a lot in America about the millions of refugees leaving Ukraine. Do you see Ukrainian refugees in Estonia?
Yes, we do. It's not that obvious. It's not like people walking like in big numbers on the streets, but you can see them in supermarkets. You can see they look a bit different in a way. They probably a little bit confused, but because ethnically they're quite the same as local Russian-speaking community, and the Russian-speaking community includes ethnic Ukrainians in Estonia as well. It's difficult to say if they have been living here for many years or not, but you can tell, and there are lots of like Facebook groups, people trying to help them, and there are like hotels dedicated to Ukrainians. One of the ferries, which used to go to Helsinki, is now converted to a hotel, which for refugees and so on.
Eva said that she wanted to end our conversation on an upbeat note. And so her upbeat note is, we know Putin will lose. He cannot win. So, whether he tries to invade another country or continues his assault on Ukraine, the world is watching and they're not going to allow him to succeed. Russia was in Afghanistan for a long time. Russia can stay in a war for a really long time. I don't know. I'm not very optimistic right now. So where would you say you fall on the spectrum?
I guess we'll need to define what is the victory. My prediction is that the hot war will be over in a couple of months, meaning that he'll occupy the eastern part of Ukraine. It's probably up to the battle on the ground fields, how much of the territory will be like under his control. And then the Ukrainians will be forced to sign kind of a peace agreement with him, meaning they will not say that's the world peace, but he'll occupy the eastern part and he'll be under sanctions for probably for forever. And for the remaining of Ukraine, it would be their chance to join European Union and start rebuilding their country. But in a way, I'm grateful for Ukrainians because they sacrificed themselves. But that's it. That Putin lost his army. He lost his. He will not lose his power inside Russia, but he lost the ability to project his power outside their Russia proper borders.
So in a way, it'll be like him taking Crimea. He'll take more of Ukraine, and there'll be some sort of ceasefire, and then life will have to go on, and you'll have this sort of Russian section of Ukraine. Is that kind of your prediction?
Yes, but I guess worldwide it'll be like different because Crimea, let's be honest, the world said, well, it's probably not fair, but let it be. And because they were not real war, right? They took it within like 2 days and no one died. Now it's different. I think it'll be like Iran story, more like that. They'll be locked inside the country and his power will still be he'll be like there forever until the next Putin comes. But it doesn't mean that the Russia will become a better state, maybe even worse. But outside, he'll be blocked in every aspect.
Did you learn in school about Alaska being part of Russia? Like, were you all taught about that?
Yeah, of course. But the major feeling in Russia that it was unfairly taken away from Russian hands, that it wasn't a fair deal, and it was never like, okay, let's take it back the same way that Crimea should be ours. That it was always a feeling of proudness. Alaska should have been Russian, but the Russian Tsar made a simple mistake and sold it for nothing.
Well, that's funny because, when that happened, it was called Seward's Folly. The man who negotiated that deal with Russia, it was considered a terrible deal by America as well. They thought that he negotiated to pay way too much money for worthless land in the Arctic.
Yeah, but of course, even now there are like many conspiracy theories that they already knew about the big gold, Russia is going to come and if someone paid whatever. So it's always like that.
Right.
Some feedback I have received from listeners is that I need to restore the book recommendation that we used to have at the end of every episode. I promise you we are going to get back to that, but today I'm going to recommend a magazine article instead. In the March 28th, 2022 edition of The New Yorker, Masha Gessen writes about the exodus of Russians from their own country because of the Ukrainian war. The article, entitled The Scattering, the Russians who are fleeing Putin's wartime crackdown, gives a valuable perspective on what it's like for people who are appalled, even physically ill, by the actions of their own country. Gessen writes, quote, "People have fled Russia because they fear political persecution, conscription, and isolation, because they dread being locked in an unfamiliar new country that eerily resembles the old Soviet Union, and because staying in a country that is waging war feels immoral, like being inside a plane that's dropping bombs on people," end quote. On March 16th, Vladimir Putin responded to the outward migration of more than 250,000 Russians with, quote, "The Russian people can tell true patriots apart from those traitors and will simply spit them out as if they'd accidentally swallowed a fly. I am sure that this natural and necessary cleansing will only strengthen our country," end quote. I encourage you to read the whole article, which is available online. Gessen interviewed many Russians for the piece, and one of them, Andrei Babitsky, says the following, quote, "I don't know what to say to a Ukrainian. I can't pretend that it's Putin bombing Ukraine, and I have nothing to do with it. I can't ask for forgiveness, because forgiveness cannot be given while Kharkiv is being bombed. So what I say is that I have a giant hole inside of me, and I ask them to tell me what I can do," end quote. It's not just Russians that need to be asking for forgiveness and what can be done. All of us who continue to stand by as Russia continues its deadly assault need to demand a stop to the killing. Alaskans, please reach out to Senator Murkowski and Senator Sullivan and plea that more be done to protect Ukrainian lives. Big thanks to Eva Finch and Valeri Zahharov for being on the show today. Huge gratitude to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. And thanks to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. Tune in next week for another interesting guest.